Well, thank you for joining us today in the studio. I'm here with Anton Shaitkin, who recently published an article in Executive Intelligence Review called John F. Kennedy versus the Empire. And we wanted to interview you as part of our series we're doing on John F. Kennedy, the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And this article, you present a view of Kennedy, which I've never seen published before, of the full international anti-imperial outlook of John F. Kennedy, even stretching far before he was president of the United States, but looking at his policies and through that lens of what his real worldview was. And it's notable that you never actually discuss the assassination in the article, but it's all of his actions which therefore define why something like that would have occurred and who his enemies were. So I wanted to ask you to start out on giving readers an introduction to this article, which they can find on LaRouchePub.com, and we'll show a screenshot on the screen here so people can find it. So if you could give us an introduction before getting into some of the specifics.
Yeah, you have to see what Kennedy faced when he came into the presidency. What was his problem that he had to solve? This is defined for him throughout the couple of decades previous. As a young adult, the son of the ambassador to Britain in the most momentous events in centuries, really. World War II is shaping up, and his mind is alive, as are the minds of humanity, to this terrible problem of the world being dragged into slaughter. He was a reporter, and his mind is coming alive in politics with these events. He then goes into World War II as a young naval officer, and all the time with his own illnesses and then with the combat situation, he knows that death is right behind him. And he goes heroically through the war, comes out, and immediately is confronted by the disaster to humanity and to America of the death of Franklin Roosevelt and a virtual coup d'etat by the power structure headquartered in London and Wall Street that takes over the presidency of Harry Truman and throws the world back away from the accomplishments of Roosevelt and threatens to throw away the American Revolution entirely. This is the catastrophe of the Cold War and of the American identification at that time with the empire, with the British Empire, the enemies of the United States and the enemies of humanity. So this is the situation that he inherits when he goes into politics and is in the Congress and then into the presidency. He has to try to deal with the America underwater, under enemy control. And as President of the United States, he puts the country back on the path of the founders and restores Franklin Roosevelt's point of view, now without the constraints of World War II and the Depression. And brilliantly tackles this problem of the imperial system, which is headquartered in London and New York. It's a British system. His whole life has been shaped for this combat, but it's not combat in the sense of just destroying. It's the fight of mankind to uplift itself with leadership. And he's going to supply the leadership. His mind is shaped for this combat. And it goes back to his preparation through his family background in Ireland. Sometimes said that he rejected that because he's the son of a rich father. But the fact of the Irish struggle in his family for 150 years against the British oppression, against mass murder in Ireland, shapes the whole concept of fighting against the empire and having to destroy that empire. His great-grandfather, his father's grandfather, was forced to leave Ireland, both as a pro-revolutionary and as a victim of the destruction of the economy and the demographics there in the enforced famine in the late 1840s, when the British Army was there supervising the export of food and starved most of the people there, and starved millions to death. They lost about 2/3 of the population of Ireland in this genocide by the British. And the Irish understood this as deliberate depopulation and destruction of the country. So the great-grandfather comes to Boston and dies there with the continuing destruction of his body from this hardship and disease induced by this catastrophe in Ireland. On both sides of his family, he has these fighters against the British Empire. His mother's father is the great mayor of Boston, revered Honey Fitz, for whom John Fitzgerald is named. That was his name, John Fitzgerald, the mayor of Boston. And members of his family, his immediate family, going back to 1797 and forward into the 20th century, are fighters against the British military and against the British secret services in Ireland, members of the Irish Republican Army in the 20th century, and people in his county in Wexford who had established the short-lived Republic of Wexford with an American admiral as the head of the little navy they had. So this is the background burning in his mind and in the mind of his relatives that is helping him to understand what Franklin Roosevelt, his commander-in-chief in battle, was up against in this imperial system. And he saw the empire as the same thing and the organizing principle of fascism that we fought against in World War II. He saw that problem in his father. The British Empire as the organizers of the Hitler-Mussolini regimes. And so when Wall Street and its senior partner, the City of London, and the royal family are continuing to perpetuate mass murder of populations in Africa and Asia, in wars and depopulation, into the modern times, into the 20th century, after World War II. And the U.S. government's going along with that and abetting that under Truman and under the Dulles brothers. This is his task, and he then takes up openly and publicly the mantle of leadership for anti-imperialism. He's the most important anti-imperialist political leader in the United States before he was elected president. He's recognized in that role by the Africans, by the Arabs, by Southeast Asian leaders.
Yeah, I think that one of the most shocking things about your article is the undeniable fact that of this international relationship he has with all of these nations against imperialism. And when you look at the full scope of what you demonstrate here, it really is, it paints this picture that then you look at what he's doing inside the United States in relation to what his role is around the world. And if you could elaborate on that, you pointed out that he was more well known internationally by the time he became than nationally when he became president, as to what his actual policies were and what he was doing in the late 50s and the early 60s leading up to what happens with the the president of Congo.
He took us a key trip in 1951 with his brother Bobby to the Middle East and Asia to study the imperial problem. And he made a report back in 1951 on the radio, on a widely listened to hookup, where he defined the problem of the United States under Truman and this Dulles-Acheson faction doing the bidding of the British and French imperial powers. And he said this system has to be stopped. The United States is being wrecked by this, and are standing in the world, and we're delivering the world over to communism and other problems by this disastrous policy. I think a crucial window into understanding the way his mind is organized for this is his book Profiles in Courage, which brings up John Quincy Adams as the central focus. It's the first chapter. It's sometimes said as an attack against him that he didn't write it. It was written by his speechwriter Ted Sorensen. And this actually is a desperate attempt to avoid the content of that book, which is deep, has many layers, and is his declaration of mental and moral independence. He puts forward Quincy Adams as breaking with the party discipline, with his own party, the New England Federalists, and going forward to then President Jefferson to back Jefferson's actions against British aggression on the United States. And that cost Adams his Senate seat. The book begins, that chapter begins, the young senator from Massachusetts stirred restlessly. Is he talking about Adams or himself? Both. And this brings up the role of those founders, including especially Adams and later Lincoln, Hamilton before him, who were individual minds in a Renaissance tradition, were not bound by public opinion, but shaped it in a way to raise the level of thinking of the nation and take on that central oligarch enemy. And this is his own message to us today and to this continuum of history, that he is on this tradition. He's on it. He knows what it is. He knows who the enemy is, and he knows what America's about.
Yeah, these two speeches that you reference here in 51 and then 57, you said this 57 speech was the most famous and felt all around the Arab world, but also the 1951 speech, you quote what he's saying about imperialism. And if you could just say more about those two interventions, which then lead into, you say he met with Kwame Nkrumah and formed a relationship with him even before he became president.
Right. So he writes this book in 54 and 55, just after he comes in as a senator. He starts as a senator in 53. And he then in 56, he is in the Senate shaping this battle. He makes this speech in 57 as a senator, which shocks the political world, where he says that imperialism is the enemy of freedom. That's the title of the speech. It's an attack on the Dulles-Truman foreign policy. And it's a break with his own party. He is attacked by the leadership of the Democratic Party, by Adlai Stevenson and Acheson, Schlesinger, and all these people. And he says in that speech that the war conducted by the European imperialists in North Africa, by the French, and with the British backing, is a catastrophe. That the Algerian Arabs' struggle for independence must be understood as in the American tradition, and we've got to back them and make a settlement with them. We've got to help bring an end to the war. This speech was worked out in advance with the leadership of the Algerian Arabs, Ben Bella and others. And that relationship with them continued past this speech, which roiled the French establishment and actually helped lead de Gaulle to an understanding of how he had to come in and settle this as president. The African nationalists, led by Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of the modern nation of Ghana, took this as a signal that Kennedy could be the president, and this would restore the kind of FDR leadership that they had all been raised as leaders to look towards as shaping the world. So this is the great star that's rising again, called the United States. Even though Kennedy is under attack, he is, by leading public opinion this way, as going way out on a limb, attacked by both parties, he shapes public opinion, and this becomes the dominant point of view in the United States of America, as well as the dominant point of view in the third world, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, shaped by this initiative and by the resonance that it has in Africa and Asia.
Yeah, you then develop how he worked with Kwame Nkrumah on a great dam, but also that the leader of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was also a protege of Kwame Nkrumah, and you said that he says, call it nationalism, call it anti-colonialism, call it what you want, but if you can develop on then what his policies were with those countries.
He very specifically uses the Franklin Roosevelt programs to restore them, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, because they're familiar to the United States, and uses that as a base for what he does in the third world, in the underdeveloped countries, and also for things like the Moon program to do the new things that were necessary. The Tennessee Valley Authority was the direct inspiration for Kwame Nkrumah, who had come here as a student from Africa, from British Africa, and lived through the Roosevelt leadership, and then went back to to Americanize, in that sense, Africa, with great projects, with industrialization. So Kennedy made a commitment to Kwame Nkrumah, whom he brought into the White House as the first foreign head of state to visit his White House, a commitment to build a great dam on the Volta River to make the largest artificial lake in the world, and use the power of that, water power, to create the electricity to industrialize West Africa. That was the explicit goal as stated by Nkrumah and as backed by Kennedy. This also involved just as the space program would do, it involved an immediate mobilization of American industrial potential. With Edgar Kaiser, who had built dams in the West with his father and had worked with FDR, he was the head of Kaiser Aluminum and Steel. He went over as the project leader for the building of the great dam, the Akasambo Dam, on this project. And the same kind of project was attempted in India by Kennedy to underwrite the building of their great steel mill project. That was sabotaged eventually, and the Soviets ended up backing that one. He had this kind of project in mind. We started that in Indonesia. We ended up being able to fund a nuclear reactor, a research reactor for Indonesia. So we had these project-oriented, action-oriented alliances with the principal leaders of the non-aligned movement, whose purpose was to get themselves out of the Cold War. They did not support American objectives and British objectives of fighting Russia. But Kennedy supported them in their neutralism because he didn't want to be in that Cold War either, and that was a setup against the American potential in the world.
And you develop also that he worked in the similar relationships with Nasser and Mattei. Is that right along the lines of what you're saying there?
This again comes off of this speech in 1957, against the Algerian War, and saying that the Arabs there have to be backed in their neutralism and their desire to get out of poverty by the United States. Enrico Mattei was the oil minister and oil developer in Italy, anti-fascist background, and he was powerful in Italy as a developer of the potential of the whole Mediterranean region. Mattei backed the Algerian Arabs in their independence struggle, and Kennedy was in a tandem alliance with Mattei. Never met him, but their work is interlocked in many ways. Mattei met with Kwame Nkrumah at the time of Kennedy's inauguration that week, and so Italian engineers went into Ghana under the leadership of the American Kaiser and under the financing of Kennedy to build that great dam project. Mattei financed the Algerian Arabs, and in that way he is in their independence struggle, so he is working in that way very closely with Nasser, the president of Egypt. Kennedy takes up Nasser's point of view on the need for Egypt and all these other countries to follow nationalism and neutralism to peaceful, cooperative development. So here is Mattei involved with Iran and Egypt and other Arab and Muslim countries and African countries, as well as Italy, in developing the natural resources and the nuclear resources to get the world out of poverty. And that's Kennedy's point of view. Kennedy's leadership in the United States made all of that actually possible and was shaping the world to get out of most of what is recognized as the world's problems today.
Yeah, I think that this would be a good point to transition to what he then was immediately faced with as president. And as you read here, there's a number of things that were done by this crowd that was opposed to these developments internationally to sabotage his presidency as soon as he got in there. But then also, if you could come back to what was the fate of all of these people that you just mentioned, Mattei and Kwame Nkrumah and de Gaulle and so forth.
Right. The attack against Kennedy's presidency, you could say, began about a year before he was in office. In 1960, in the election season, they began in London and Wall Street an attack on the dollar to sell dollars for gold and for other currencies, and to transfer deposits outside of the United States. And this was stepped up after he won the election, before he's inaugurated, and the dollar is in great danger of being destroyed quickly for so-called lack of confidence in the American leadership and implicitly in Kennedy coming in. So he's put under pressure by this attack to choose Douglas Dillon, international banker of this fascist set, to be his Secretary of the Treasury. He puts him in there, but he completely ignores him and his advice about what to do. At the same time, the Central Intelligence Agency and leading elements of the U.S. military are under the control of this faction, very close-knit little clique around the Allen Dulles, his brother John Foster Dulles, a couple of Democrats led by Harriman and Atchison, all of them bound up with the highest level British, not only the royal family and City of London people, but the killers, the real stinking mass murderers in London, and they're friends of the same quality in France, Spain, and elsewhere. But this is particularly you look at this with Allen Dulles as head of the CIA, having been put in as head of covert operations in CIA by Truman earlier. He's head of CIA under Eisenhower. They set up the Bay of Pigs invasion and blackmail Kennedy on going ahead with that, even though it was programmed to be a disaster. Couldn't succeed. He was threatened with the use of those Cuban emigres who were sent into Cuba to try to supposedly overthrow Castro. If he didn't go ahead with it, they would be let loose inside the U.S. To do dirty operations against him and political warfare. And you see that whole mess in operation in New Orleans and the Caribbean while he's president. That's what's going on. This is an assassination capability developed by Dulles and the British. And the same kind of assassination capability is unleashed and controlled by them in Algeria by using these white European settler fascists and their rage against Kennedy and against de Gaulle, who takes Kennedy's side to support the Arabs. You see this in the murder of Patrice Lumumba by the British station chief. She admits she organized this, Daphne Park. You can look this up in an article that came out in 2012. Dulles, the CIA, run by him, that faction, and the British together have this assassin capability. They murdered the president or the prime minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who's a follower of a protege of Kwame Nkrumah, 3 days before Kennedy took office as president, knowing that he would never support this. And it was covert. It only came out. He only learned about this more than a month later. There's a very poignant, famous photograph of President Kennedy on the phone with his face contorted with pain, hearing for the first time that Lumumba has been assassinated. I think this is in February of 1961. Mattei, his ally, was assassinated by this OAS, the secret army organization of the Algerian fascists, which is coordinated really by British intelligence. Leaders of that went into Britain. They were celebrated there. He was assassinated. His plane was sabotaged. They tried it earlier. That was in the headlines. So Mattei was murdered. There were several headline attempts on the life of Charles de Gaulle by this same CIA MI6 apparatus, British apparatus. And Kennedy fired Allen Dulles and his two principal aides in 1961, early in his presidency, after leaking to the American press from the White House that the CIA under this leadership was a state within a reactionary state within a state, and that it was consorting with these insurrectionists in Algeria openly, and this is intolerable. So he is on this assassination team. He's on that. He knows what's going on, and he's hitting that by reorganizing the leadership of the CIA to as best he can right away in 1961. So there are assassinations throughout his presidency by this gang.
And can you also just say what happens with Kwame Nkrumah, because that all kind of completes the picture.
Nkrumah was repeatedly the subject of British assassination attempts. He cut his intelligence and security ties to the British as a result of this. And the dam was only completed and dedicated in 1966, 2 years after Kennedy was murdered. They put a plaque on the dam thanking John Kennedy for financing this. And 1 week after the dam was dedicated, Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by a coup that was planned in London. The headline is "Coup Plotters in London, the Secret Plans," and so forth. That's the New York Times. And he was then overthrown. Sukarno was overthrown. Mass murder was carried out by this team of the British and this faction of American intelligence under British control. This was the coup d'etat against the U.S. position in the world. It was the destruction of America's place in the world, America's initiative, America's projects, America's friends. Look forward to today and see that America has no friends in the world. There's no nation that is our friend. Why is that? Because they don't have interests common with us? They all look to American leadership implicitly, and it's not here because it was murdered in the 1960s, and the United States was induced to change its culture, its strategy, and its own interests, just to betray those interests, which are the interests of the rest of humanity for rapid industrialization and population growth. That's the interests of all of us. The British murdered our president with the help of these traitors, like the Dulleses and their friends, in order to eliminate the United States from its role in the world and from its rightful place as a leader of the world.
Yeah, just another question. One of the things that you go through here, there's a lot of books today which will talk about the Cold War and whether or not Kennedy really wanted to pull out of Vietnam, or whether he really fired Dulles because of the Bay of Pigs. And some of these, and people go tit for tat. But I think what you go through here is really the deeper understanding of what this so-called, what the Cold War was really about, and therefore what Kennedy was doing leading up to this June 1963 speech on really the developing a relationship with the Russians.
To understand this simply, you have to start with the facts on the ground. The facts of his presidency, what he came in with, these confrontations with the Russians that he had in Cuba, both the Bay of Pigs, which was the setup, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians tried to overcome their slipping into second place behind the USA, Kennedy's USA, because he's building up U.S. power. So they tried this adventure of putting nuclear missiles on our doorstep, and he faced them down without humiliating them, and then goes beyond these confrontations on his long-standing policy of getting out of this trap, which was set up by London and Wall Street, this Cold War, this British policy of the Cold War. Get out of it. The facts of what he did, as you see this developing in 1963, the confrontation with the British in the Congo to defeat them militarily using the UN as an American instrument and keep the Congo together. The British tried to break it up. The denial of the British nuclear war capability by stopping the Skybolt missile, which astonished the British leadership that he would take them on that way and say, no, you're not getting this from us. And his changing the strategy of the NASA program, of the space program, from simply the U.S. getting ahead of the Russians in the space race to asking for United States-Russian joint missions to the moon and beyond. And this was an increasingly active and active measure of this presidency. The arrangements for this joint action went originally and continually through the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So you had the best minds in the USA and the Russians involved with this. There's the Hugh Dryden, Kennedy's envoy, the American scientist, and the Russian Sedyov carried on this beautiful relationship, both of them experts in nonlinear science of turbulence. And Kennedy's insistence that there be a common interest approach to solving the problem of the Cold War as the model for solving everything, a common interest approach to solving the Arab-Israeli problem, Pakistan and India, with the Israelis. And this bears on the Cold War, and it bears on our problems today. Israel was given the nuclear weapons capabilities by the British-French leadership in 1956 in the Suez Crisis to induce them to invade Egypt to try to destroy Nasser. They gave Israel bomb-making capabilities. Kennedy, when he became president, intervened in Israel to try to stop them from making nuclear bombs. This became a strong preoccupation. He was demanding the Israelis open up their nuclear facilities. The way he wanted to solve that Israeli paranoia was to set up joint nuclear-powered desalination and industrialization projects between Israel and Egypt and other Arab countries. And it's a mutual interest action. Don't wait until everybody's changed their mind. Don't wait until nirvana and utopia. Act now to set the nations working on joint projects that transform the opportunities and the possibilities for profit and future survival and existence and happiness for their children. That was the idea with the Russians. So we had, for example, with the Russians, a joint program to develop nuclear desalination throughout the world to get fresh water into every country that needs it. And that was put into the IAEA. 25 countries headed up by USA and Russia were involved in that. So how did he view the Russians? Well, as an American nationalist and as a realist, he separated communism from the national interests of Russia. He saw what the Russians themselves had trouble seeing. Some of them could, but many of them were clouded by communist ideology, by Marxist crap. And so he said, your government inside Russia is none of our business. That's not the issue. We can't allow you as an aggressive, ideological, really paranoid operation to be destabilizing and threatening the peace of the world. So here is the way I'm offering for us to work together as nations. on the Earth, in outer space, and in problem solving. And even with Van Cliburn going to Moscow and playing the piano. Here's the way we're going to get out of this. And the Russians were all for it. His speech in June of 1963 at American University challenged the Americans to look at Russia from this same point of view. Yeah, communism is a disaster. It's wrong. It's wrong historically. What about Russia? They suffered the most in World War II. They're a great nation. We've never had a war with them. We are two great nations. There's a lot alike between our two countries. And we have this mutual interest that you better think about, that all of our children are going to be killed quickly in an hour if we don't take the right path. That's a mutual interest right there. Think about it, Americans. And the next day he was speaking to Americans about their race prejudice and how, blacks are concerned to 100 years after Lincoln to get freedom now. Why should they wait some more? Otherwise, the United States is going to go to hell. So he's really challenging Americans, Russians, and the rest of the world to see this is America's mission. This is what we had from our revolution. What is that mission? Action to improve things. The mission of the United States is action on the ground, physical action, moral action, but it's something that you can see, that's demonstrated by your actions, not just some rhetoric, not just some theory. The theory is the Renaissance theory. The theory is very high theory. But the action of America, its mission, is what we did here, which we then shared with the world. We showed them what we did. We invented electricity. We developed the first nuclear power, the first nuclear, atomic pile, and that was going into nuclear science as well as the bomb. And Kennedy said, let's damp down the bomb and develop the science and develop nuclear power. And beyond that, people's view of these things is so curtailed by gossip and rumor and pettiness that we have since his murder. Was the moon program a gimmick to best the Russians? Think about what it was. It wasn't simply to go to the moon. It was to go to Mars and the other planets. Kennedy was personally involved in the development of the nuclear rocket that you must have to get to the outer planets. The original Kennedy program, I believe, was to get the Americans and others on Mars in the 1970s. Shortly after he was murdered, that was shifted to the 1980s and then dropped and blocked by the current gangsters. So this is Kennedy's mind. It was always shadowed by the knowledge that he could die soon, including the knowledge that he could be assassinated. And he brought that up in this period of 1956 when he's speaking to people as a senator. He made a speech to the Irish Americans on St. Patrick's Day, bringing up the British assassination of political leaders and of resistance fighters. And assassination, he recited a poem, a very poignant poem about that. And in his Profiles in Courage, he's speaking about the Puritan point of view, which is answerable only to God, not to public pressure, that allows them and an individual from that standpoint to stand up to torture and the potential for being murdered. So what? I have to do what I'm going to do. I'm enjoying it, and I want you all to enjoy making the world better. He was a happy person. And that happiness we should get back now and recover in this way from this crime of his murder.